So I have the pleasure of introducing you to Professor Anita Rampal from New Delhi, India. But before I say anything about who she is, I think we all need to be remembering the context of India as very different from what we think about as context. India is 68 years old, young democracy. It's the largest, most populous democracy. It's a country with more than 122 official languages and over 1,500 unofficial languages and dialects. So just to give you a sense of the linguistic diversity. And there is also vast cultural diversity. India is a country that, when it, at the independence, I think the literacy rate was something like 15%. Unfortunately, after 68%, we still haven't gotten to 75% yet. Why is it that? Because the country also is so diverse. It's how do you educate people in their own rights? And that's the work of Anita Rampal. So Anita will be talking about things that are about the society part very strongly, and how society and language and literacy and science understanding all come together. So a little bit about Anita Rampal. She started her educational journey as a theoretical physicist. And in the 70s, she, with some other physicists, they were very involved, strongly involved in Hoshangabad, what's the name? Hoshangabad project, Hoshangabad Science Project. That's in central India, a small town where they started intervention of grounds up science education. What should it look like for the people, science for people? And she has done a lot of work on situations, similar things like that, and she will tell you a lot in her project, in her paper, in her presentation now, so I'm not going to repeat her things here. But one of the things I want to say, you all can download a fantastic publication called Numeracy Now. Numeracy Counts. It's free downloadable document that will show her work and her colleagues' work in India as how they're approaching numeracy issues for a country as diverse as India, where there are more than 122 official languages. Some people are very rich and some vast majority very, very poor. So how do you work on numeracy? So with that, I'll stop here and let Anita speak her story. And after Anita's presentation, Robin Jorgensen from University of Canberra will be the respondent. Thank you.
Morning. I think this is really the best place to be talking about this work. And this is a lot of us who've been working in education. And as Robin was saying, things in India they happen. Much of this work in the 70s started because the government asked a group of scientists to come and do science education in the village schools, because as the administrator said, I mean, even though they had no degrees in education, he said things are so bad they can't make it worse. So that's the way things started, and it was amazing because it was really participatory work with teachers. And then I'll go along the journey and say how one has to be prepared, because there are all kinds of contingencies. And even though all these textbooks that I'm talking about we have struggled to have them free, online, downloadable, but many of these school textbooks, we don't know how long they'll be there. We have a new government, so that's the story. This was what maths really means to a lot of our children. This is just 2 months back, this was a news report that this man was jailed because he tied his daughter for her maths exam and someone saw it, took a photograph, and he was jailed, that how dare he tie his child on the cycle. And this is what he said. He said, the whole night, I've been thinking about it, but if she had failed that maths exam, I don't know what I could have done. I just want her to study, and I don't want her to end up like me. I want my children to do well and escape this life of poverty. But maths somehow is a killer subject. And I'll talk about it, why it has been so crucial for us to address this issue. Maths exams have caused high failure. Even this year in Delhi, the capital city, there were schools around my university in which almost 80 to 90% children failed in class 9 and class 10, sometimes for the second year in maths. Because till class 8, we have a Right to Education Act, which after a long struggle, and I wish to pay tribute to my husband who really was involved in this struggle, right through the work in the 70s, much of this work, and in the Right to Education Act. And even though he was battling a personal struggle, right through that, he worked to get this out, to get political consensus and to get the government accept that it's the right of every child, because the children were getting marginalized, the poor children were getting alternative schools with teachers who were paid $10 a month, and things like that. So in the name of saying that we were universalizing, we were actually marginalizing the poor. So in 2010, we managed to get something which is, we look at it as an enabling act, but it's radical because it said you can't fail a child. You can't detain a child for the first 8 years. You have to give them that opportunity. It's their right to learn. And it said you can't have selections because schools go through selections, especially the elite schools. And it said you can't use any form of selection. So anyway, that is a struggle. And there were major reforms in the curriculum about which I'll talk about, but not as much in assessment. That's still our vision, to get assessment done in more meaningful ways. What is being assessed and how? In fact, right now, I have a PhD student who's working on maths assessment, and we find that when you do assessment in a culturally responsive way, the same children of class 8 who are failing, they cannot even find out what an average is of some numbers, the kinds of things they did just because they were engaged with it. They did a project on the midday meal. They did a project on their own school. They did a project of the locality that they stayed in to find out probabilities, to find out the gender-sex ratio, to question these things. But in the school exams, you can see what kinds of questions they are getting even today after this major reform. And but there has been a tremendous change in one of the states, in Kerala, which is for us, in terms of even educational provision, one of our leading states. And there, the whole pattern of reform they found many years back, 10 to 15 years back, that if you make it contextual, in fact, even in the exam, before they start a question, they have a non-evaluatory discussion session, or they have a singing session. They sing, like if it's a language class, they'll sing before the exam, they'll sing something, they'll talk about it, they'll discuss why do we take loans, why do we go to banks, is it good to take a loan or not, when did my family take a loan? It just sort of engages them with the kind of question that's going to come, and also gets them, it sort of brings the fear and the intimidation sort of less, because you feel less threatened by what's going to happen. So this is the kind of questions that the teachers felt that you must, they take actual advertisements. So they took 2 advertisements from 2 banks, and then they frame a question around it, and things like that. So I'm saying that is something in assessment that one state has been doing, but it's not there in the national context. Now this is about how we first started. And this, because the government said, science education, many of us, we were PhD students, we were volunteers, some of our teachers were going there, so that's how we went. And this is a little clip, it's an old film, it's about 20 years old, but it just sort of gives you an idea of what was happening there. And there's this little girl, Soni, who in one year in 1993, suddenly people stopped eating the green vegetables because they said there's a snake curse on the vegetable. They saw these white lines, which were because of the leaf miner, which embeds its eggs there, and they eat up the chlorophyll before they come out of the leaf. But people thought it was very close to a festival which celebrates Naga Panchami, which celebrates the snake, so they thought it was a curse, and truckloads of vegetables were being thrown into the river. And the question was asked in Parliament. everyone sort of media was asking what is happening, no one was doing anything, but we got phone calls that these little children had themselves sort of discovered what it was. So this is just a little story about her. And even at that time, there was a threat that the program might close because a very conservative government had come into the state. So some group came from Bombay and filmed this. But it was interesting that when this girl was being filmed and we called her mother, I don't show you the entire piece, suddenly she felt that, she was being recognized. And the mother told us on film, and the girl used the camera as a jury. She told her mother, will you let me study further? Because at the age of 11, she had been married. She was just 13 or 14 when this film was being made. She had already been married. And she tells her mother on the camera, why should I go there? He is not studying. I want him to study also, the boy to whom she had been married, but she had not been sent. And she's using the camera, to assert that, please let me study. And she did study. She went on, she did her class 10 board exam. I got a small little postcard saying that for the first time, my father says you should become someone, because they were both daily wage laborers of the lowest, sort of most disadvantaged caste. And this had never occurred to parents to tell their children that you have to become someone. It's just because she didn't fail for 10 years that they felt that she has some agency. And she tells us that she took the exam to join as a policewoman. But she says it on the film, I'm not showing you that part, but then she couldn't get through. So she said, what should I do? I said, well, there are many other things. You were more interested in other things. So she took the nursing exam. She went to the biggest city close to her town, her village. She took the exam, got through, became a nurse in one of the best colleges there, and now I've lost contact with her, but I must sort of go and seek her.
Learning by rote from some book, the children learn through direct observation and experiment.
This was her school, and they're going in, when they're filming, they talk about her, because she was then in a...
The emphasis is on the method of science and on learning from the environment. They gather samples, including things that are not given in their textbooks, and discuss their findings in small groups.
ये जकड़ा है ये भी इसके एक ही जैसे दिख रही है मतलब ये अलग क्यों है ये मुसला जड़ हो सकती है हाँ ये मुसला ये काला रंग ये पत्ती खाती है ये चला देती ये खा गई है ये खा रही है हाँ ये खाना चाहिए तो क्या बना है इसके सामने से आकृति बनते हैं ना देख इस आकृति बन गई है चलो मैडम से पूछते हैं मैडम
हाँ क्या हुआ
मैडम
हाँ ये वही पत्ती है ना इसके ऊपर ये आकृति बनी हुई है कैसी दिख रही है आकृति
ये सांप
जैसी इसकी तो बहुत मजेदार कहानी है तुमको पता है सुना है तुमने ये कहानी नहीं सुनी
One summer, people were alarmed by the sudden profusion of white, snake-like patterns on the leafy vegetables that they ate. Rumor attributed these to a cobra's curse. Truckloads rotted.
These were in newspapers,
Questions were raised in Parliament. No one had an answer. Until Soni, a student from this very school, decided to investigate.
पत्तियों पर नाग नागिन मन जाने से सब्जियां खाना छोड़ दी थी जिसे हमारे घर में मेरी मम्मी और बहनें भी खाना छोड़ दी थी यहाँ तक कि मेरी बुआ है ना उन्होंने 8 दिन तक उपवास भी कर रहे थे तो मैंने कहा कि अब ये ऐसा है क्या उपवास वगैरह कर रहे हम तो हमारे को मैडम बताती स्कूल में कि ये सब अफवाह है हमारे से बातें भी चलती थी तो मैडम ने हमने पत्ती जाकर बताई मैडम को कि इस पर जो सांप वगैरह मर है कि आप सच मानते इनको तो मैडम ने कहा कि हम तो सच नहीं मानते
ये यहाँ का बढ़ जाता है इसको निकाल सकते हैं अपन टीम से निकालो इधर काला काला दिख रहा
The teacher said, I don't know what it is, but I don't think it's a rumor. I mean, I don't think it's a
लकड़ी
curse.
उठाई हमने तिनका बारिश था और उससे खुरेदा तो उसमें से तो पहले यानी कि ऐसा ही मरा हुआ कीड़ा वगैरह निकला मैंने क्या कुछ होगा फिर दूसरी पत्ती तोड़ी उसमें से खुरेदा तो उसमें से फिर कीड़ा निकला फिर मैंने इसको रंगाई और फिर पिछाड़े से एक पत्ती तोड़ी रिसेस में और उसमें से कीड़ा निकाला
निकालो उसके मुंह के वहाँ से निकालो हाँ निकालो धीरे से निकालना हाँ
I went to a lot of colleges in that area after this and asked the young students.
बताया मम्मी वगैरह बहन को कैसा, तो फिर मेरी बहन तो मानती थी कि इस पर हाँ सचमुच में नाग नागिन है। तो बोले कि तुम तो अपने आप को थोड़े बहुत पढ़ के लिए अपने आप को बुद्धिमान समझते हो। मैंने उसको बता के देखो, आप तुमको बुद्धिमान समझते हो ना, इसमें से कीड़ा निकला। बोले कि हाँ सच बात है।
मैडम ये तो बहुत बड़ा हो गया। बड़ा हो गया? हाँ। बड़ा दिखाई दे रहा है। हाँ। होगा नहीं।
These were small part of the science program. $1 microscopes, you know, that we had given to them.
खाते आगे बढ़ता जाता है। हाँ। तो यहाँ आके बिल्कुल मुंह का शेप बन जाता है इसका, तो ऐसा दिखता है जैसे नाग हो।
फिर मैंने अपनी बुआ को भी बताया कि इस पर तो नाग नागिन नहीं है, तो कीड़ा हैगा छोटा सा। उसने बोला कि हाँ हम तो 8 रोज से उपवास कर रहे हैं और इसमें से कीड़ा निकल गया छोटा सा। तो उसने फिर उपवास यानी कि बाद में करे, उसके बाद या नहीं करे तो मेरे को नहीं मालूम, कि बता तो दिया। और हमारे बोले ने जैसे भोसे मार रहे थे कि हाँ सचमुच में नाग नागिन है। उनको भी मैंने जाकर बताया।
This is a 500-year-old poet, Kabir, and this is a village team which sings his songs, which are very, very radical. He had questioned all kinds of religious scriptures. And even though this was a science program, we had included much of mathematics in this because we had just this space, the science curriculum. And we thought that even though things like probability were taught much later in class 10, we thought that was so crucial for their lives to even address issues like chance and destiny and what is random, what is probable, so, and how to relate it with everyday life, which they did hear about these things. So we had included it as a chapter, and I just, this is a little clip, this is not so good in quality, but just telling you how it was done with children and teachers also, how the teachers got, because teachers had their own strong beliefs, and even when they played a game and you asked them, can you, can you predict what you're going to say? They would say yes, and I'm very good at throwing dice, and I can assure you I can get 7 heads in a line. And there were all kinds of things. So this is a part of, this just shows you how they also went through this training.
To teach in a manner that enthuses and inspires is a skill. Eklavya holds special training workshops for the teachers taking part in their program. Many of the trainers here are teachers themselves.
आपका पाठ है, आप पीछे जाइए। आपका चलिए पाठ पीछे। कहाँ है चित आपका?
चित आएगा। अच्छा, कितने कहते हैं पट आएगा? अच्छा, रश्मि तुम्हारा क्या आएगा? नहीं बता सकते अपना?
कि पहले से कुछ कहा नहीं जा सकता, चित भी आ सकता है और पट भी आ सकता है।
यह भी आप लोगों में कुछ लोग कहते हैं कि चित आएगा और कुछ कहते हैं कि पट आएगा। तो अभी हम खेल खेलने चलेंगे अपना अपना सिक्का और चार्ट लेकर और देखेंगे कि किसके ज्यादा चित आते हैं और किसके ज्यादा पट। जिनका चित आया है वे पोजीशन ले लें।
This is from the textbook, class 8, and you may not be able to see it, but it's just got things like, it's got questions about seeds which are planted, and if you can find out roughly what is the probability from seeing whether you do it with 1 seed or 10 seeds or half a kg, so getting to large numbers, and then also doing things like probability when you go for your blood test. Why do they take different samples? What happens? Is finding probability always so easy? Can you tell when it's going to rain, etc.? So it was just trying to relate some of these. at that time still not going so much into subjective ideas of probability, which much later, recently, a PhD student of mine worked on, and she actually changed the curriculum, proposed a curriculum from the middle schools using many more sort of ways of looking at subjective probability. But anyway, this program was always sort of very close to disturbing people, and politicians could use any sort of excuse to try and get it closed, but this was one of them, when they said learning by doing means teaching how to gamble, and so they said this program has to be closed. But it was interesting. This is probably the first time in the history of our legislature or parliamentary history that there was a long note written by one legislator who actually came, read in the libraries, discussed, and talked about how gambling, in fact, was the birth of probability theory. And he wrote about it, and I saw he actually quoted different textbooks from different countries to say they all talk about card games and poker games. And he says gambling cannot be stopped through, it keeps stopped only through science education, not through moralizing. And he said legislators must not decide on science and math policy, first educate themselves. And he went through a long discussion of what happened to Galileo and what kind of political interference, what it has done to science. And he was not a scientist. He was, it was just that he read up and he felt very strongly about it. And he asked the state, he said, there was a big state lottery which was done every day. He says the state runs this and earns a lot of money. Isn't that gambling? So it was interesting that the program was not closed at that time. Anyway, despite this long history, and the program was eventually closed in 2002 after 30 years of running. And again, because the state felt that, well, we are doing a lot of innovative things, we can't run this. And there was a constant battle. There was a tension to work with the government, to push the government, and yet at times disagree with them. Like in the Bhopal gas incident, this organization had strongly, the organization which was set up, Eklavya, then had taken a very strong stand and told the government that it's your culpability also, what has happened in terms of the massacre and the disaster. So, well, these were, until 2005, these were the national kind of textbooks. This is the way they just gave definitions after definitions and terms after terms. And it was a challenge because we worked in different states, and then when we got an opportunity in 2005, many of us, academics and activists and people from NGOs, came onto the national stage and made teams and started working on this. Before this, in the 90s, as Shapna said, the literacy campaign, in fact, was inspired a lot by Freire's work, and it was decided, and a large organization which I have worked with, BGVS, Bharat Gyan Vigyan Samiti, which actually was set up to work in literacy. It was a people science organization, but a separate wing was set up to work on literacy and development. And we worked with the government. We said, let it be a campaign mode, please don't pay volunteers, don't do it in the official bureaucratic manner, but let it be really through people's mobilization. And almost in 500 districts, with almost more than 3 million volunteers, this program was conducted for almost 10 years. The 90s was a very heady period for many of us in working in education. And this book, Numeracy Counts, comes out of working with adults and youth out of school. So as I said, this was also about to read and write their world, because people wanted to change things, and they were actually using some of these things to do participatory resource management, to do things in a collective way in their own villages. So this is just a snapshot of what they were doing. They would organize a metric fair, a metric mela, in which the whole village would be invited. So it was not just the neoliterates, but the neoliterates would conduct, they do stalls for the literates. And they do all these things challenging even the literate people. Can you guess this, and can you guess that, and do you know how to measure this? What is the length of your nose, etc., etc. So it was great fun for everyone to be involved. It was not meant only for the neoliterates. So, so we had organized these in many districts. And taking from that, from what we learned in terms of people's own understanding, their own ways of looking at maths, the way we tried, when we got a chance in 2005, then a lot of that came into the textbooks also, into the primary textbooks. Because I noticed that even though I was on the syllabus committee right across, but I noticed that the primary was not being looked at so seriously, and that really, when I saw the draft that was prepared, it was extremely conventional, made no sense to anyone. So then we immediately got down to that in an emergency kind of a situation. Also, I talk about the pedagogy of empathy, what that means, and how, because there are such diversities and there are so many strong sort of disparate lives that have to be looked at. And what does a national textbook mean? Because you really try to take context from across the country, even though every state has its own board and its own textbook. But the national textbooks were meant to be kind of exemplars and also used in the central schools or used in Delhi, in the state of Delhi. But other states have now adopted these. They put in a few chapters of their own, but they've adopted some of these primary books. The senior books, the senior classes, they make their own books. Real life context, and this is about the way we tried to work on the books. We tried to break the boundaries between the 3 subjects at the primary level, class 1 to 5, age 6 to 11. And the 3 subjects are language, environmental studies. Environmental studies is meant to integrate science and social studies, which often does not happen, is difficult, and mathematics. So not only integrating science with social studies, but we tried to really break the boundaries. So if you open a book, often you can't tell what subject it is, but even though we maintain an area, but we try to break these boundaries. Other than, there were some conceptual units, obviously all chapters were really based on concepts, but there were some units which were thematic. So in every textbook of maths, we had at least 1 or 2 thematic units, which covered various concepts which had been done till that age, till that stage. And some of these were like building with bricks, which was based on a true life story of some masons trying to make a brick pattern after having been inspired by this mosque, which was built by their ancestors 300 years back. And the kinds of brick patterns that they saw there, we don't see today. So they actually went there with an architect, came back and built a school building. So it was a story also to look at heritage, craft, and other things through these thematic chapters. And I'll look at 1 or 2 of them. This was the prehistoric paintings of Bhimbetka. So what does that mean? And what do 10,000 years, what does it mean to a child? There were some cross-disciplinary themes, which, for instance, mapping. We found that the syllabus was very weak on this. The syllabus did not really look at it. So we introduced these in the maths textbooks. Also in some of the language textbooks, but specifically in the maths, because we noticed that even in Delhi, in very sort of elite schools, children living in an area could not, even at the age of 11 or 12, could not map their own area where they live, because there was no aerial perspective and no one really had looked at spatial understanding in that way. So this is, for instance, these are 2 maps. One is a 11-year-old child. This is for the first time, the 13-year-old child actually understands that the area where she lives is like a loop. It's like a closed loop. The children, 9-year-olds, were always making a straight road. And when you ask them, they said, well, we never turn back. We always walk straight. So, you know, they always made their maps. They said, I go from this place to that place, but they always made it straight. So even while we were writing these books, though we did refer to a lot of work on children's thinking, but while we were doing this, we constantly tried to revalidate our understanding, and we found that, yes, even in the best, so-called best schools, children were not. So we introduced many new chapters in the maths textbook about this understanding. I mean, it could be a little rat which goes up on a hydrogen balloon, and how perspectives change as you go higher up, or many other things. And for instance, even to introduce for the first time a map, we tried to use iconic maps. We used an aerial photograph of a place which we think all children know, because this is the national sort of Republic Day parade is held in this area, so they see it somewhere and they hear about it, and then match it with maps. So these were kind of themes that we also brought in. Also, we tried, what do numbers mean and how do you relate two numbers, how do children relate to that? So we tried to bring in a lot of measures from their life, the way they look at numbers, and tell them that don't get lost in these zeros, but think of it in this terms. How do you think about large numbers? So, for instance, in the BRICS chapter, we said, well, this number, 100,000, also called a lakh, it happens that we have so many brick kilns in the country. And what else do you hear when you hear about a lakh? So footprints, for instance, actual size of different animals, what kind of footprints, compare it with yours, etc. This is now, I'm looking at giving you 2-3 examples just from the chapter on time, because we noticed, and we tried to get our friends to send us books from different places just to see, is someone looking at time differently? So someone sent us Japanese books, and we couldn't read Japanese, but of course we can make out in mathematics what they're doing. And we found that, no, there were some things people were always looking only in terms of clocks and calendars, and there were no sort of cultural ways of engaging with this. So we decided that this was something, we were not going to tell children, well, 1 week is 7 days and 1 day is 24 hours. It made no sense. So we gave them and we actually engaged excited, enthused artists, because artists will say, maths textbooks, no, keep us away. And then we tried to sort of tell them that they must work with us. And before this, we use a story which is deliberately all topsy-turvy. All the time words are used in a topsy-turvy way. So, whether a bird's nest, how long will they find the eggs in that, or how long it takes for something to fall. So deliberately use a different word and tell them to correct it. And it's great fun for them that the book is wrong and they're correcting it. And then we take examples like how long does it take to do something? So what takes minutes, what takes hours, and what takes days? So you give examples. Look around, ask people, give examples. It also, of course, helps you value time and value labor. So think of other things, what takes seconds, and then what takes months, and then for a baby to come out of her mother's stomach. So, again, these are things which are kind of hush-hush for children, and then you talk about it in the textbook, so they feel good about it. Then there's a little cartoon. Now, this is a makeshift toilet, and someone, long queue standing outside saying, this should take only a few minutes. so, you're kind of also having fun with them and subverting some kinds of discourses of the textbook. Also asking them, how long do you think you take for a bath, or do you take a bath? So it's that kind of thing, trying to engage with children. And finally, in this chapter, we had not yet, this was class 3, this is age 8, we had not yet looked at number line. So the first time we did it, we looked at a timeline. And we looked at a timeline through a person, a real person, her story, and I remembered we had filmed her during the literacy campaign, it is a difficult story. She is from Jharkhand, an indigenous area, but she, as she tells you in the story, that she lost her husband when time stopped. Time went very fast when she had children, and then suddenly time stopped. Her husband died, and her husband's brothers then declared her a witch. And she was, it was gory. When we met her, she was absolutely shattered. And we met her because the literacy volunteers supported her to go and file a case against her own husband's brothers, because they had stripped her naked. They had pulled her, dragged her on her own fertile land right in front of the whole village. And she was really shattered. So they then took her to the police station. She registered a case, and she actually fought a case for her own land. But we don't go into those things. But she says, they declared me a witch, and I, for the first time, went to a police station. So when we brought things like this, of course, some of the teachers and the middle-class teachers in Delhi said, you can't talk about these things to young children. How can you talk about this? So we said, well, when the last Harry Potter book was declared, how many hours did you stand in a queue to go and buy that book? And do you stop your children from watching witches on television and to see all those cartoons? So if you allow them to see cartoons, why is it that they can't engage with real lives? But here she's struggling. She fought it, and she fought a case. So, it is sort of her agency and her sense of empowerment. And why can't we bring it? Isn't it inspiring? So, we had to also sort of, as you might understand, these are things which you can't easily bring into the textbook. So, and as Giro says, not to fall into this pattern of infantilization of the curriculum, which we often find happens. Even the illustrations are sort of deliberately sort of very comfort-giving comic kind of characters, and we didn't want that. Even with, so many of the standard illustrators which NCERT gave me, I had to say no after a week because we didn't like the way they portrayed things. And we had to get to people who understood folk art, contemporary art, sensitive to these kinds of things, and gave people characteristics, didn't give them just dots or something like that. So it was, this was of course one chapter from a true story of a woman. She tells you her story. She runs a junk shop in Bihar, which is a very feudal state and a very caste-ridden state, a very sort of patriarchal state. And she runs there in Patna. And after the textbooks have been running, she tells us people come to her shop just to see her because she's a textbook hero, that she's come into these hundreds of thousands of textbooks for the last 9 years, and people just come to her shop to see who she is. And it's her true story, what it meant, why she did a recce. She did not start a bangle shop, as people suggested, or a beauty parlor, as people suggested, but she started a junk shop. And even though it's considered dirty work, and people laughed at her, but her uncle said, no, continue, do this. And she said it changed her life. Her husband, who was running a tea stall somewhere, stopped his tea stall, came and joined her, and today it's a large enterprise where she sends things for recycling, and she took a loan. So what does taking a loan mean? People know that, What does a money lender mean to a person? And this board says, Sumitra or Kiran ki kabad ki dukaan, and that's her mother-in-law. So even that is unusual, that you took a loan with your mother-in-law, and then your board says that your mother-in-law and you own the shop. So the whole chapter is around the kinds of things that she did and the kinds of calculations and all that. Well, this is the last slide. What does mediating reform in the real world mean? I mean, as you might have seen and you might understand that we have had sort of times when we've had real sort of open space and we've used it as much as possible for large numbers and sort of large changes, and then suddenly we're ready that, a conservative government might come, something might happen, yes. So how do you strategize that same experience? Where do you use it the next time? And so, of course, the main thing, of course, is this mathematics? I mean, even the national body where we were making these textbooks, once this draft was ready, the head of the department in that wrote to the director saying, it does not really follow the syllabus, so we can't print it. So I mean, the director asked me, because I was the chairperson, so we've used these positions to further, whenever we've found this problem. So I wrote a long note saying, this is the syllabus and how we strictly followed the syllabus. And we followed the NCF because all these things were being said by the National Curriculum Framework. That, you must use different knowledges, bring people's lives. And so we quoted from the National Curriculum Framework. And so anyway, so there are layered negotiations, very difficult negotiations, which can topple very fast, and it was interesting that the media really supported this, because the young reporters who came, they just related to it as their lives. They said, we hated maths. And when they looked at these things, the kind of the reports they wrote, I couldn't believe it. And in full page, we never have a newspaper giving you a full page coverage on a textbook, never happens. But they would do that with photographs. And they would say that, this is maths has come closer to life. Or they actually went and they met some of these protagonists. A year later, they went and spoke to some of the protagonists who were in the textbook, and then they wrote about their lives. So it was very exciting to see how these young reporters were empathizing with this exercise. And and whenever they came, I said, first, please look at the old books also, and you tell me what is the difference. So, it was fun doing this. But my question is, and this also relates with what Ole was saying, that a lot of the sort of the major obstacles, a lot of the problems, the hegemony of what maths comes from the university. And we also face this. Even in our science textbooks, we made a major change in the elementary books, but for the higher science, these university people would come. I'm myself a university scientist, but they would come and say that no, not this, and this must come, and this concept, irrespective of the child, irrespective of the child's ability to even understand that concept. So this is what, even MES, if MES is working in maths education and society, I think a large dent also needs to be made, as he was saying, to renegotiate what this means and what maths learning means and how it's connected with life, because we have not been able to do this. In some areas like history, in political science, the group was such that we managed to make a difference in classes up to class 12. Unfortunately, not in science and maths, of which we've had a longer history. We've had many more people working in these areas in our country than in the more politically sensitive areas, and yet our groups and our academics are such that we couldn't sort of really break through the barrier and go right up. Thank you.
I'd like to thank Anita for a great presentation. It's always nice to hear stories from other contexts and other countries. So thank you very much for that and for sharing so many great things. And I'd like to thank the organisers for allowing me to be able to respond to your paper. You've seen my slides, so I probably don't need to go through too much. My initial response, and a bit like Danny yesterday, the presentation was a little bit different from the paper. So the initial part about assessment wasn't in the paper. But what I wanted to say still holds. And I think what Anita's posed to us in this presentation resonates a lot with the work that we do in MES. So many of the theoretical perspectives she's drawn on, such as ethnomathematics, situated learning, and critical mathematics, are embedded in what we've seen today. So I think a lot of your work has resonated very strongly with the MES community. And I think every one of us probably can take something from that. And it also highlighted for me when I read the paper, and if you get a chance, please read the paper, because there's a lot more detail in the paper that Anita obviously hasn't had a chance to include in the presentation. And it highlighted for me a lot of the work that Anita's done. It's not just in maths, it's in science, it's in adult literacy, it's in literacy, it's in adult context as well as the school context. So the work that you presented today is only a little bit of what's actually in the paper. And so it's said to me that the work covers a significant corpus of knowledge and a significant area of the curriculum as well. The thing that I really want to focus on though, and I don't think we got a sense of it from the presentation, Anita's work started back in the 70s. So that's quite a few years ago. And in fact, if you think about it, that's spanning 5 decades, that some of the work that Anita's spoken about today. What I want to really do is talk through and pose the question to us as the MES community. What Anita's work has really shown is that in contexts such as India, and I think we can all resonate with them in our own context, is that there's a lot of work that we need to do to engage learners, whether they're preschool children, school children or adult learners in their journey into maths, and providing them ways to enter into mathematics, to engage with mathematics and to be able to be successful in mathematics. And that may require quite a lot of different approaches, and I think what Anita shared with us today is some of the work that she's been doing in that area. And probably for many of us in a much more complex situation than the context that we work in as well. But what I want to really draw on in the response is that in thinking about Anita's work, and again, what didn't come out in the presentation as strongly as it did in the paper, is that Anita's work's has been going on since the 1970s. She's done great work and a block comes. She's done more great work and another block comes. You alluded towards the end, but in the paper it's a lot more evident. And so for me, what really struck me as I read the paper, apart from the great work that's being undertaken by Anita and her team, is that when we take reform work, we come across these barriers. And I want to return to, so I really wanted to think for us to talk about in our groups later on, is this last point, about the ongoing sustainability of reform. So if we go back to one of our, I'll call it MES1, whether we call MES1 or MES, I think for our Spanish speakers, I'm going to go for MES1. This is one of the context statements. Recently, and I think, recently, so we're talking nearly 20 years ago, recently education has become more overtly politicised throughout the world. In many cases, this has been part of the conservative restoration, systemically turning back reforms gained over several decades, in other cases in forms of new colonisation with developing democracies turning to Western academics for answers to complex problems. So if we think back, one of the things that MES is concerned about and was concerned about then was the conservative restoration. And if we think about most of our political context, and Anita, it was a nice segue into this reaction, was her concern now with conservative governments coming in. And even though all of the resources she's got, she's put them online, they're freely available, what will be the status of those resources when this conservative government perhaps gains more traction? So for me, what I think we need to do in thinking about us as a community of scholars, as the MES community, is thinking about the shifts in our field. What is the threat? And I'll come back to those words of the conservative restoration. 20 years ago or 18 years ago when MES was formed, we were worried because we had quite an innovative period and we were worried about this conservative restoration. I don't think that conservative restoration is such a term anymore. I think we have got conservative regimes that are operating, and it has actually become a reality. So even though we noted it 20 years ago, we now have it as our reality. We have lost, if we think about our international community, Anita's work has raised the issue of what happens in the Indian context, but if we think I'm trying to now internationalise it. If we think about our international community, a couple of years ago, we know the great work that happened in Holland with the Realistic Maths program that was based on research, it was based on children's thinking. That program's nearly fallen over for all sorts of reasons, despite the great work and the great investment that was made in that. I think we're also got to look at, and as I was reading Anita's paper, it struck me with a lot of the work that I'm doing in the Australian context. So I sort of try and make some links back to the Australian context now. A lot of the innovations that we're now seeing in education is what I'll call old wine in new bottles. For example, in my work as I'm going around Aboriginal communities, what I'm seeing is very, very highly marketable, I'm trying to think of a nice way to say it, highly marketable resources that are being sold to schools who really, many of the teachers are clutching at things, what can I do to help my Aboriginal kids learn mathematics? As I look at those resources, they are the stuff that we did in the 60s and 70s, and all they've done is put didgeridoos and kangaroos around the borders, and it's just, as I say, it's old wine in new bottle. We're selling stuff to Aboriginal teachers of Aboriginal kids that we knew didn't work in the 60s and 70s. We've Aboriginalised them. They think they're doing the right thing because they've bought a program that actually has been tailored to suit Aboriginal kids. It's the same stuff we knew that didn't work before with non-Aboriginal kids, but now we're trying to sell it to Aboriginal kids. So I think some of the innovations that we're now working with are highly problematic. I think the other thing that most of us are probably concerned about in our own context are things like the implementation of basics. I'm not sure about the reforms in the US. Somebody might want to talk about that in their own sessions. But across Australia, and I know in the UK, there's been a strong focus on getting back to basics. Our kids aren't doing well in national testing. Our kids aren't doing this well. Our kids aren't doing that well. We've got to get back to basics. And within the Australian context, we've gone for a move now where we've gone to direct instruction. Again, in many of the Aboriginal communities, they've gone to direct instruction. So in one region of Australia, up in the Cape, which is that pointy bit up the top, there's a cluster of schools. They've bought into direct instruction, which I believe is an American program based from the 60s. They've spent $25 million on that program to implement it in that cluster of schools. We could question that, but one of the big blockers for that is that one of our most powerful Aboriginal leaders has said we've got to do something for our Aboriginal kids. We can't keep failing our Aboriginal kids. So he's bought in and I would say been conned by somebody, and then he's gone on and conned our government into spending $25 million for 3 schools to do direct instruction. Now, sadly, what's also happening in our Australian context, and I suspect it's in everybody else's context as well, is that we've gone into the privatisation of our more middle-class, affluent government schools, which means we're kind of starting to move towards a ghettoisation of our low SES, and I think the term that's used mainly in America is the urban setting schools. And what the intent is at the moment is that if direct instruction works in our underperforming Indigenous context, it's now going to go into the state schools, which are the state schools who are not independent government schools, which by implication means it's going to go into our low SES schools. So I think what we need to do, and Anita's presentation has taken us through much of that journey, is that as the MES community, we need to start thinking about what's actually happening in education. So the conservative restoration that we worried about at our initial MES, despite what the work that we're doing in the MES community, seems to be, we seem to be losing that battle, guys. We need to think about what we're doing. When I looked at just this conference's papers, there's 60 research papers that are presented at this conference. Just a little bit of simple math, and I've done the translation. I'd say maths, but I'll be inclusive. So a little bit of simple multiplication says, well, we're sitting over 8 MESs, 60 research papers, 480 papers. Let's round it up to 500. So just within our group, we've had at least 500 MES papers that are probably embodying the work that Anita's done in her context and our context. And yet our work isn't being heard. We've got to start thinking about why is that the case. If the conservative restoration is a concern in the Indian context, and I'm sure it's a concern, I know it's a concern for some of us in the Australian context. Other people might think direct instruction, the Aboriginal, didgeridoos and kangaroos is the way to go to fix our Indigenous problems. We need to be thinking about our work. And there is a plethora. So if we think just about our 500 papers from MES, if we think then about who are our MES authors and all of the work that we've collectively done outside of MES, I think we need to start thinking about what's the impact of our work and how can we sort of start to work against the conservative restoration from our first MES. So they're the questions that I think that, for me, Anita's presentation started to raise. It really struck me that this is great work. It's gone on for 5 decades. A conservative government in India at different times has blocked some of that. You've been able to overcome them in different ways, shapes and forms. But I think the conservative restoration from MES1 is not a threat anymore. It's a reality. So these are the questions that I think I'd like us to consider in our working groups later on. They're wordy, but I think you'll get the gist of what they are from what I've been talking about. Is the challenge to the conservative restoration possible in mathematics education? Are we actually able to do that? And if so, what needs to be undertaken to arrest the agendas of the Conservative politicians, Conservative policymakers and our funding agencies. I'm not sure what happens in your countries, but I know in our countries now we have an independent research body, and that is our peak research body. And previously it was very, very independent of policy and government. We now have national priorities for our research. We must target our research applications to meet at least one of those research priorities. And then once the grants have been awarded through a very strong peer review process, government can still decline those research grants to be awarded. So we've got to look at those sorts of, even our funding for our research may also be shaped by our Conservative agendas. And questioning the return of the old agendas and practices. I know, and I'm being very confident, that if I now wanted to write a research grant about the positive impact of direct instruction working with Aboriginal kids, I think that I'd probably get that grant, which is a worry. Not that I'd do it, but I do know the pressure, and I'm sure it's everywhere, the pressure on us to get high stakes research grants for the status of our universities means that some people will do those grants. And I know colleagues who have done it just to get the grants. So I think we need to start thinking about those sorts of issues. But also, what would a coherent reform look like? And as I thought back, having gone to quite a number of the MES conferences and just looking at our shifts in our own field, the different theoretical frameworks, we've gone sort of almost from a critical sociology to postmodernism, and I know in the some of the sessions yesterday we were raising all the different theories we use. We have changed a lot as a field, but we also need to be thinking about, well, what would a coherent, and I use coherent really loosely because I don't want us to think about a direct instruction of an MES format. I'm not proposing something like that. But what would a coherent reform look like? And it struck me as I went through Anita's paper, is there's lots of different theories that you've drawn from as you've undertaken your work, but they've all pretty much remained true to that format. And I think one of the things that often can happen in a format like MES, we can talk amongst ourselves, and that can be really good. It can be very affirming. So for all the new grads coming into a forum like this, can be affirming because you know you're talking to the same people. We're all on the same page. But how do we make that singing of that hymn be heard by somebody else outside of our field? How do we get that being heard by the politicians, the policymakers, the education reformers? One of the person who has managed to get direct instruction into Australia, he just says he's a politician groupie. If Labor's in, which is our left-wing government, he sleeps with them. If our Liberal government's in, he sleeps with them. He says, I'll do whatever I need to do to get something happening for my people. And I'm not advocating that we do that, but some people will do that. But maybe we need to think as an MES community, what might a good reform look like for us if we really are about empowering the people that Anita's been speaking about and the people that we talk about in our MES forum. And what have we learnt from nearly 2 decades of MES? What have we learnt from the research projects that we have undertaken? What's coherent about our work? What's different about our work? Where do we have our resonances with the field outside of MES? Also, I think we need to think about what have we learnt as a community of scholars as to the hurdles for learners and learning, where the learners can be the kids in schools, the people that Anita's talked about today, but for us also. And I think one of the things that we probably don't do well is actually start to lobby politicians about our voices. It's harder to get our voice heard. If we went to the politicians with a back to basics approach, they might hear it because I'm sure we've all heard those stories that when we talk to parents, and I know with my work with Aboriginal people, when I ask often the families, what do they want? They want to have their kids tested. They want to go back to basics. When they were in the missions, the nuns used to belt them if they didn't do their work. And maybe we need to have a bit more discipline in our schools like they had. But if people don't know know what education's about, if people don't know the issues that we talk about in an MES forum, then they go back to what they know about. So maybe we need to be more vocal in terms of people hearing the issues that we're talking about as well. I know that all of our contexts are different, and I apologise that if I'm making a general statement about different countries, but I think if you can just take the intentionality of behind what I'm saying, that would be useful. I also think it might be something that we might need to think about in terms of the future too, and I think this will build into our Agora meeting at the end of the Friday session that Peter was talking about earlier on. So what are ways that we might start thinking about mobilising action to not combat the conservative restoration, but start to combat some of the conservative policies that are emerging and that are impacting on us as well. So what could happen in the Indian context? So if the Conservative government does come in and takes off all of the great resources that you've shared today, Anita, what could happen in the Indian context to sort of either arrest that or overturn that decision? And I think we could, as an MES group, start to form a fairly powerful international lobby group, because this is not something that's happening in India or something that's happening in Australia or something that's happening in, God help us, Spain, if you're still there. So I think this is an international phenomenon, and I think as an MES community, and I think, Anita, your presentation today has raised that. 70 years of reform, a Conservative government coming in, actually is a huge concern for us. So they're my questions for us. I think they're fairly deep ones, but I think we sort of can start to think practically, pragmatically, as well as theoretically and methodologically. So I'll finish there. And Anita, thank you very much for a great presentation.